So, I told myself that I was probably never going to do a book haul. And here I am. But what makes this one different is that all of these books that I consider my long lost library, are things that I thought I had lost several years ago. So for reasons that are irrelevant, I packed up all of my books, some of these books I've had since I was a child, and shipped them across the country. And by the time my person showed up in that location several months later, they were gone. No one in my family could find them. I enlisted help going through the attic, through the basement, going through, closets and corners. These are two big cardboard boxes of books, and nobody could tell me what happened to them. So I was understandably upset and spent the next several years on and off getting bursts of energy and going and tearing around their house again. Eventually, I resigned myself to the fact that they had probably ended up in some old storage container, which had then eventually been sold off, and I kind of just let it go. Until 2 days ago, when my family decided to do a garage sale with the neighbors and looked in a closet that I had literally never seen before because the door had been covered with stuff, and found all of my books. I do not think I can explain how grateful and overwhelmed and happy it made me to recover something I felt like I had lost. And since these are all books I've had for a really long time, I have read all of them, or read all of most of them. And so this is going to be a weird haul since I'm familiar with these texts, but it's been so long since I've touched them and smelled them and read them that I know I don't remember all the details of the plot or why I love the characters. And since I have already started rereading a number of these books, I'm going to save the more in-depth reviews for later, for a wrap-up, or for another type of video. But today I just want to show them to you. And I just want to share why they were so important to me and why they even made it in the box to make that cross-country journey, since I used to have a lot more, and before I did all this packing I had to, cull them down. So first I want to start with a familiar title, Icarus Girl by Helen Oyeyemi. I actually just talked about this book in my Black Booktuber tag, so I'll put that in the atmosphere if you want to learn more about it. But this ended up in the box, I'm pretty sure, because it was the first time I had read a story about a girl who was living in two cultures. Now, she is British and Nigerian, the main character Jess. I am Black and Puerto Rican, and that's pretty much where our similarities end. But this character stood with me for a long time. She was stuck in my brain, and part of that had to do with her cross-cultural experience. Also, she's an introvert. She spends a lot of time in her head. I just felt really seen when I first read this book in high school, and so it was one I definitely wanted to keep. The next book I have is The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien, or There and Back Again. So this book actually has a note from my dad inside, and it is from November 16th, 2001. To me, from Daddy. Harry Potter, Harry Smarter. The Hobbit is the best. I'll enjoy reading and discussing both with you. So my dad never really got why I was so into Harry Potter, but he did like the fact that I was reading. And to this day, we do still read books and discuss them together. I read this because he bought it for me. I don't remember really loving it, and I keep it because it's sentimental. I also never read the Lord of the Rings books. I never read the Silmarillion. So this is one I'm not sure if I'm going to reread. Maybe I should give it another chance now that I'm an adult and not, 8 years old the first time I read this, but it holds sentimental value. So, The Hobbit. Next, we have Things Fall Apart. This book, I remember being so angry the first time I read this book in school. It tells a story of Okonkwo, who is a man who is so, oh my gosh, sorry. This is actually one of the ones I have recently reread, and so I have a bunch of emotions about it. I said I wasn't gonna do the in-depth reviews. I'll save this review for later. The reason I kept this book is because it was my first fictional experience with colonization. But before this, the only context I had really was a little bit we talked about in history class, and then Pocahontas, which is a whole problematic film in and of itself. And the way that Christianity is used in this book as a weapon to completely destroy a culture that is deemed foreign and backwards, the way in which Okonkwo, who is the main character, is shown, I believe, very, very, he's shown in a way that is very human. At various points, Achebe is clear to talk about the ways in which he is strong and powerful and proud and successful, and also the ways that Okonkwo is angry and impulsive, and the fear of becoming like his father guides his actions. And I don't want to spoil the end of the book if you haven't read it, but there is a very tragic ending that speaks to the dismissiveness and the ignorance of the British missionaries and the British government that instills itself and takes over this fictional African village. This book, I think, was published in 1958, I believe, 1959, and oh my gosh, just the Yeats inscription in the beginning: turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer, things fall apart, the center cannot hold, mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. This is a book in which there are no wasted words. Every single word is chosen so specifically, and the way these people are described in all of their glory and all of their folly leads it to a quick read. It's a short book, but an incredibly impactful one. And I said I was not going to review this book, but I'm reviewing this book because I love it, and it is no surprise to me that it ended up in this box, and it's no surprise to me that this was one of the first books I have I have started to reread, or this is one of the first books that I have reread in my attempt to reread most of these. So things fall apart. Next we have Coming of Age in Mississippi by Anne Moody. Now this book used to belong to Jill Diamond. Don't know who that is because I stole this book from a bookshelf in a middle school English classroom, but I kept it. My seat in that class was back against the wall, and so I would lean against the wall, zone out, daydream, and one day I saw this book with this black woman on the cover kind of looking wistfully out in the distance, and I snagged it, and I sat in the back row and I read it over the course of several classes. And then when I moved from that school, I took it with me. I'm assuming Jill Diamond's okay with it because that book had been sitting there for a minute. But this is an autobiography, as the title says, the classic autobiography of growing up poor and Black in the rural South. This book was a personal confrontation for me with some of the things I was learning about in school. Now, she grew up in the 40s and the 50s and then is an adult in the 60s. And the book ends, in terms of timeline, I think like 1967, 1968. So only a few years after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. I don't actually remember a lot of the details of this. This is one I'll definitely be rereading, though, because I remember I read it multiple times, which says something to me because I love to reread books. So Coming of Age in Mississippi. Next we have Justin Pollard's The Story of Archaeology. This was just a fun book. This was not a textbook or anything that I used in my classes, but I remember seeing it in Barnes & Noble, and look at that, opening to a page that I love. Who Owns the Past? This was one of those books that I remember not reading all the way through or reading all in one sitting, but kind of opening up when I was bored and going through certain chapters. I'll probably do the same thing again. I can't imagine wanting to go through it all at once when it's really more of a review, an overview of the history of archaeology. But even though I no longer have plans to work in a museum as a curator, even though I'm not a shovel bum, I do still have a lot of interest and passion for the field of archaeology. So this is one I'll be flipping through. Maybe not reread all the way, but flip through. Going to more sentimental books, we have The Far Side Gallery 3, The Far Side Gallery 4, and The Far Side Gallery 5. These are all by Gary Larson, who is the iconic cartoonist. If you have ever known a single academic in your life, I guarantee you they will have at least one Gary Larson cartoon taped up in their office or on their door. Gary Larson became famous for the Far Side Gallery style that is mainly black and white and gray, although he did do some full color ones. They're often incredibly witty and sartorial. They'll play on, common themes and invert them. They are often very little text, just one-liners. As you can see, it's either a caption or a thought bubble. And they're just so freaking funny. They're so good. They're so good. These books are so good that they made me want to be a cartoonist for a long time. I would actually draw my own little comic strips and try to write witty one-liner quotes, and I would show them to my dad, and he was very encouraging. I don't really draw much anymore, but these are books that they're just fun. They're just fun to flip through when you're in a bad mood. I'm really looking forward to sitting on the couch on another rainy day and just kind of going through and laughing. One of my favorite Gary Larson, one of my favorite Gary Larson cartoons I saw when I was a kid and was really, really into nature and animals and the environment. And it showed two apes sitting on a branch, one grooming the other. And the one who was doing the grooming pulls out a blonde hair and says in an accusing tone, "Another blonde hair. See, you're hanging with that Jane Goodall tramp again." I'll put it on the screen. I don't know if that's as funny to anybody else, but that was one that I found uproariously hilarious as a 12-year-old who had, recently learned about Jane Goodall by going to the Atlanta Zoo. The next book I want to talk about is Candide by Voltaire, also Zadig, I never learned how to pronounce that, and Other Stories. This was my first, I would say, more mature interaction with satire. Like, before reading this, I did not know how to read satire. The first time I read it, I was so confused because I was taking everything very seriously and at face value. And it wasn't until I did some Googling, watched some YouTube videos, that I realized what this is, who Voltaire was, because I think I was in high school or middle school when I got this, and I had no idea about this, witty, sarcastic, lush French philosopher, what his deal was, and where he was coming from, what lessons he was trying to impart with this story. Again, this is another one that I don't remember a lot of the details of, but I probably kept it for that reason, because it introduced me to a new style of reading that I wasn't familiar with. And I do remember laughing at some of the more racy bits. Again, I was 13 or something when I first read this. So this is something I'll definitely read again, especially since I have now in my adult life worked on the opera version of Candide. And so I've seen it, I have worked on it, I have a different understanding of it when you're watching all the characters come to life and you're hearing this big, beautiful music. So having all that in my head as I read this, I think would make it more interesting. The next book I have is also poetry, also in a small burgundy frame, and all I have to go on is Poems by Patchen. I bought this at a flea market, and what really struck me, honestly, truly, before I read any of the poems, was the signature. This book belonged to someone named Fern Rowlands, and she bought it in June of 1947. Something about seeing that, about holding something that another young woman had held so long ago, I had to pick it up. According to the Inner Flap, this was first published in 1936. And I will have to say, there are a lot of poems in here that kind of evoke something I don't quite understand. But one of them that I want to share, I remember not really being prepared to read when I first read it. And it's called Nice Day for a Lynching. The bloodhounds look like sad old judges in a strange court. They point their noses at the Negro jerking in the tight noose, his feet spread crow-like above these honorable men who laugh as he chokes. I don't know this black man. I don't know these white men. But I know that one of my hands is black and one is white. And I know that one part of me is being strangled while another part horribly laughs. And until it changes, I shall be forever killing and be killed. I realize now I probably should have done a trigger warning, and I apologize for that. But as someone who had never heard of Kenneth Patchen before, and who picked this up, again, in a totally random way, more because of the beautiful signature from the young woman in the 40s and the poems themselves, this is one of my favorite books of poetry. And not every poem is that heavy or that dark. Some of them are actually very, very kind of funny and irreverent, and long before Milk and Honey, little drawn illustrations in their poems. Oh my gosh, this one I really love too. She knows that it is raining and my room is warm, but she is proud and beautiful and I have no money. I really don't feel qualified to talk about poetry. I've never taken any class. I don't have any formal education. I just know what makes me feel things, and I am very much looking forward to sitting down and reading all of these poems again. because even looking at them now, I remember how I felt when I first read them. So, Selected Poems by Kenneth Patchen. Changing topics entirely, we're going to go with The History of Death, Burial Customs, Funeral Rites from the Ancient World to the Modern Times by Michael Kerrigan. How do I explain this book? I wouldn't consider myself morbid, she says, as she holds this book, but I've always been very fascinated with death. I don't think I could be as interested and passionate about religion and spirituality in the afterlife if I was not as interested in death. I really like this book because this was a book that I wished I had written. When I was in college, I was like, you know what? I just want to study all these different cultures and their different attitudes towards death and dying, their attitudes towards grieving and burial and reincarnation and afterlife. And it could be this whole beautiful The book already exists. The book exists. It's super fascinating. I love looking at all the different cultures and the religions and the ways in which death informs their perspectives of life. This is one that I am really excited to reread. I'm definitely going to reread this whole thing again because I'm sure I've forgotten things, but this is a book I wish I had written. Next, we're going to take it all the way back. We have World Encyclopedia. I know having an encyclopedia seems weird, but hear me out. I used to sit in my father's study with this book on my lap, just flipping through these big, beautiful pages and, this text that was very accessible and easy to read for someone my age, learning about all these different cultures and lands and people. I mean, this book is probably the reason I like to travel as much as I do. And this book taught me about dating. This book came out in, I believe, 2001. So they were still using after Christ, before Christ, AD, all of that. So this is before Common Era and before Common Era. But I remember the day that I figured out what all those little letters meant along the timeline. I was like, okay, BC means before this period in time. And Jesus Christ is this person. And he died. It was just, it was such like a moment for me. And I never forgot it. And not gonna lie, I'm probably gonna reread this entire book too, because it's just, I think you're noticing a trend here if you've watched any of my other videos, how much I like anthologies and encyclopedias and overviews, because if I can read, as can every adult, I'm sure, these 2 paragraphs about African empires and then read this timeline of major dates, and then based on the art, based on a name, a factoid that inspired me, I can go find other books specifically about certain things. Like I love getting broad overviews and seeing what piques my curiosity and then going deeper. And again, I have a lot of personal fond memories of feeling like this book was as big as my entire torso as I lay with it open on the couch. And it's one of the pages that is actually if I just kind of let it fall to the ground, it would automatically open into that, is the Mayan page right here. I don't know if you can tell that the book is kind of strained at this point because I don't know why. I really don't know why, but Mayans. And then I eventually went on to do a number of school reports in high school and in college, actually, on Mayans and Mayan death rituals and such. So you never know which things that strike you when your children are going to come back later. But you will be seeing that book again. Next, we have Anthony Burgess, A Clockwork Orange. This is a different one. I kept this book because I did not understand it. I read this book once in high school, once in like late middle school, early high school, once in mid high school. And the second time I was able to pick up on more, not just because of, the different language that the characters speak in the story, but just trying to understand what exactly this thing was about. Like my very vague memories of it are of like the violence and the assault and, these boys running around in a gang acting in these wild, uncontrolled ways. I know it's not, that's not what the main focus is. It's mainly a tool to get to the larger themes. And since I have since seen the movie as an adult, I know what those themes are, but I do want to revisit this book. I know it's not going to be an easy read, but the fact that I kept something that I didn't fully understand because I knew that one day I would, I think means something. So I want to honor younger Shay and reread this book. Next, we have a couple children's books. Told you I wouldn't stop talking about them. The first is Way Up and Over Everything by Alice McGill. And this tells the story of a family of slaves who come in contact with, oh, let me be clear, a family of slaves who everyone was born in the United States. And they come into contact with some new people who were recently enslaved, brought over from the shores of Africa, and the ways in which these people retain their dignity and retain their magic and eventually up and fly away. I remember Googling this story when I was older and finding that it was actually a very common folktale among enslaved peoples in the Americas, that people who were closer to their African roots, or who were Africans who came over, that they, retained some of their power in a way that people been born in America or had generations already in America did not. This is gonna go with my children's books. I cannot wait to read it again. And whoops, I stole it from a library. Sorry. This is back when I lived in the Midwest. I'm sure they'll find. The next we have Robert D. Sansucci and Jerry Pinkney. You've heard those names before. The Talking Eggs. I have talked about this author and this illustrator before. These are two of my favorite children's books artists. I have a lot of stuff by them. This was what I consider to be my favorite book growing up. I love this story of young Rose and a very strange, magical, sometimes scary old woman, and a story in which it is not someone who is just simply beautiful or simply born a certain way that makes them the heroine. Rose is kind, she's responsible, she keeps her word, she keeps her promises, and I talk about this book a lot more in my favorite Black children's books, and this is my actual copy from when I was a kid, so I'm not opening it, because I made that mistake the other day and some pages almost fell out, but The Talking Eggs. Next we have Change Me into Zeus's Daughter by Barbara Robinette Moss. I don't know where I got this book from. I don't know why, as like a young Black Midwestern teen girl, I would have picked up a memoir by a white woman growing up in Alabama in the 60s. But I love this book. I have read it so many times in my life. And even right now, I could probably give like a full review if I needed to, but I'm not, because I'm going to read it again. This book was it felt like my first up close and personal interaction with poverty. I grew up in a middle-class family. Both of my parents came from what they would describe as working class or working poor families. That's not what this is about. Barbara is one of 9 children, and she grows up with a talented, intelligent mother, an alcoholic, abusive father, and this kind of goes back and forth between the past and the present at the time in which it was written, and how the relationships with her family, with her father, with herself, and her own beauty shaped her life. Change Me into Zeus's Daughter is a reference to the fact that because of malnutrition, because of poor health, her body and her bones and her face and her teeth all grew and shaped in ways that are frankly unnatural. And in her desire for beauty, which kind of follows her throughout her life, it also mirrors her experience growing up, coming of age, turning into a good parent, not an abusive one, an intelligent, hardworking woman. This is a picture of her family on the cover. And it starts in 1962 and ends in the 1990s, I believe. And I just want to read a section of the back paragraph because I think it's so accurate. Change Me into Zeus's Daughter is a haunting and ultimately triumphant memoir about growing up poor and undaunted in the South. With an unflinching voice, Barbara Robinette Moss chronicles her family's chaotic, impoverished survival in the red clay hills of Alabama. It's that unflinching voice part. There is no woe is me in this. There is no, begging for sympathy or accolades. Like, this is a memoir in which I feel that she is really just trying to capture the memories of her past and tell her story, not trying to twist it in one way or another. Of course, I don't actually know her. I don't actually know her parents or her siblings, so I don't know the ways in which her perspective may reveal certain sides of the truth that her other siblings may have shared differently. But in the beginning of the book, she says, where is it? In the beginning of the book, in the acknowledgement, she says, "My intention in writing this book was to go back in time, to heal old wounds, and to reclaim my family." And I feel that she really does that. This is a beautiful, beautiful narrative about a group of people, about a subsect of humanity, like a section of humanity, working class / poor white families in rural South in the 60s that I never would have stumbled across on my own, which is why I don't remember how I got this book. but it's just so well written and poignant and specific. And although some parts are very hard to read, given the nature of her relationship with her father, it is absolutely worth reading. So I can't wait to read it again, and I'm so glad that it was in this box of books. Next, we have Roald Dahl Treasury. Now, long before I knew anything about Roald Dahl's opinions or his time in the military or any of this other wild stuff I learned as an adult, he was simply my favorite author. I just, the stories that he wove and the illustrators that he worked with, like, I love these stories so much, and I actually loved his work so much that I bought and read 2 of his biographies. One was Boy, I believe it was, right, and the other was Going Solo, which is when he was in the military. So as I say, I didn't realize he was in the military. What I meant was I didn't realize at the time, like, all of his, like, espionage work. That's the Roald Dahl that I didn't know. But, you know, this is a book that I don't know if I would reread. I don't know if I get as much joy out of reading these stories as I will the children's stories. Maybe there's something to that about early age literature versus, I don't know, would these kind of things be middle grade? I'm still learning the genres, but this just brings me joy just to have it, just to hold it in my hands and see it. And especially for, oh my gosh, James and the Giant Peach, Fantastic Mr. Fox, I might have to read these again, because I feel I learned so much about people, just like what makes a good, charming, interesting person, what makes a clever, person who has ingenuity. I will never forget, I think it's the Twits, I'll never forget the Roald Dahl story in which they say that you can have crooked teeth and frizzy hair and a lumpy body and old clothes, but if you're a good person and you have a kind heart, that will shine out of you, and everyone who will look at you will know that you are beautiful because you have a good heart. But even if you have all of the fashion and accoutrement and nails and makeup, whatever, if you're a bad person, that'll radiate out of you too, and everybody can see that. It can see that ugliness inside of you. I don't think that's exactly how life works as an adult, but reading that as a young girl made me feel really good, because as someone who didn't always feel very comfortable and confident in her skin, I was excited at the idea that if I worked really hard to be a good person, then people would be able to see that. So even if I don't actually end up rereading this, I will always have to thank Roald Dahl for that. The next book is the Essential Van Gogh. I don't have much to say about this one, so I know I never actually read it. I just flipped through the illustrations to look at the paintings, but Van Gogh was my favorite painter when I was a child, and last year I actually got to go to Amsterdam and finally go to the Van Gogh Museum, which was really everything that I wanted it to be. So can't say that I'll read this one, but I'll definitely be, lovingly going through it again. Probably should have said Van Gogh. I'm sorry. That's how he would have pronounced his name. Next, we have, I'm going to do these together, even though it's going to be heavy. An illustrated reference to the myths, religions, pyramids, and temples of the land of pharaohs by Lorna Oakes and Lucia Gallen, Ancient Egypt. And then Ancient Egypt, Land and Lives of the Pharaohs Revealed. So when I said that I was an archaeologist, my degree was actually Archaeology and Culture of the Ancient Near East, and that was inspired by, my goal with that as a child was to leverage that degree into a career in Egyptology. So I got these books when I was a kid too. They are very large. This one is older, so it's a little more fragile, so I'm going to hold that in its hands. And again, this is the, oh gosh, I don't even want to hold this up to the camera because it's so fragile. But again, it's that broad overview, like that thing I was talking about. I'll hold this one just because it's a couple years newer. Accessible text, beautiful illustrations, goes in chronological order. I, of course, had my favorite chapters and my favorite sections, the ones that had to do with death and dying and mummification. Wasn't too interested in farming or, royal duties. But, some things never change. I will not be an archaeologist. I came to that conclusion when I was in college, and I was like, I do not have the language skills for that. But I will always be fascinated with this history and this culture. And even if these are just going to sit on my nightstand or on my table, I am very, very glad to have them back. Oh, look who has woken up. Good evening. Okay, as long as he behaves. Next, we have another book I'm sure you've never heard of, the Celebration of Young Poets, Ohio, spring 2005. I had a poem in this as well. I fancied myself a poet when I was a child. I don't really write much anymore, and I probably should, but these two books, this one and the one I showed previously, these were my claim to fame. I was a published poet, and I was very proud of that when I was in grade school. Sometimes I wonder what would happen if I had kept writing, where I would be now, but, you know, maybe somewhere in the multiverse. And the last book I want to talk about, oh my gosh, I don't know how y'all do these huge book hauls and I'm out of breath, but the last book I want to talk about is frankly the one that is the most important to me, and it was the one that I was most upset to lose, and so it's the one I'm most glad to have back, and that is Treasury of Children's Poetry. Holding this together with Scotch tape, I have no idea where the dust jacket went, and this was edited by Allison Sage with a foreword by Michael Rosen. So this book is an anthology of poetry. And the reason I love it so much is because this book goes in order from the simplest, easiest poems, Mary, Mary, quite contrary, Ba Ba Black Sheep, to much more difficult and intense and adult poetry, such as poetry by James Barrie, by William Shakespeare, by William Blake, by Walt Whitman. And I have read this book so many times, and I will read it again gladly. The reason this book was the one that was most important to me was because this is how I measured my childhood and my adolescence and my teen years. Every time I read this book, I would stop once I got to poems that I didn't understand. Like I could read, like I could understand the words, but poems that I didn't get, you know? And so every 6 months or so, sometimes every year or so, I'd pull this book back out and I would read it, and I would note, oh, I'm further this time. I'm furthest this time. I'm growing up. That's what this book meant to me. That the fact that each time I got further and further, it meant that I was growing up. And like I remember Ozymandias is in this, or excuse me, the poem. Oh my goodness gracious! I am Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look upon my works, ye mighty, and despair. Like that poem. I remember when I got to that point, and I read it, and I was like, oh. It just felt like this moment, you know, for some reason, this book, this was my Sweet 16, this was my quinceañera, this was getting my first period, you know, this was graduating high school. Like this book to me marked my childhood, my adolescence, my teen years. This book marked the passage of time. It was me growing up, and it was a consistent benchmark I had for maturity and intelligence and reading comprehension. And you know what? Going through these books again is reminding me how much I love to draw, how much I love to write, how much I love poetry when I was younger. And it's kind of bittersweet that I don't really do those things anymore, but probably says something that the book that was most important to me was/is a poetry book. So on that note, about growth and time and writing and love and art and growing up, this was my long lost library haul. I know it was kind of long, but thank you for sticking with me throughout it. I would love to know which books mean things to you. Not just books you like to read and books that you keep, but books that you feel have been a part of your life, whether that is when you were younger or now. I would really love to read them and see those in the comments. And you will definitely see a lot of these books again. I think I bought 2 books this month so far, and I do plan on reading those, but I'm just so excited to have all of these back that they'll be taking up a fair amount of my time for the foreseeable future. Thanks for listening. Bye.